So our first speaker is Carrie Kandall. She's an undergraduate student at Boston College. She's going to present for 15 minutes and 5 minutes for Q&A. Her research presentation topic is analyzing fast fashion using environmental, social, and governance and financial reports, a look into H&M. So welcome, Carrie. It is your time. Please feel free to unmute yourself, start the video, and share your screen.
Thank you, Cecilia. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to talk to you all today. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right, awesome. So again, my name is Carrie Kandall. Thank you, Cecilia, for the introduction. I'm an undergraduate research assistant in the Aftermath Learning Lab, and I'm so excited today to talk about my research in ESG reporting in the fast fashion industry. So this is just a quick overview of some of the topics I'm going to go over today. First, I'm going to provide some background information. Then we are going to dive into ESG reports and finally talk about opportunities for growth in the future. The goal of my research is to conduct an analysis on how ESG reporting is used in the fast fashion industry and how we can leverage this tool to hold companies more accountable for their post-consumer actions. Today, I will be using H&M as a case study. However, a lot of the conclusions I make from H&M can be generalized to the rest of the fast fashion industry as well. Before diving deeper into my presentation, there are a few key terms that I'll be using throughout that I want to define early on. First, ESG reports, also known as sustainability reports, are voluntary disclosures of the environmental, social, and governance activities within a company. The goal of these reports is to increase transparency for customers and investors about different dimensions of the company. Oftentimes, unlike financial reports, these reports are not completely standardized, so companies are able to pull from different frameworks to create their individualized reports. The next term I would like to define is Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. This is a way to categorize how greenhouse gas emissions are emitted along a company's value chain. Scope 1 emissions come from a company's activities, and Scope 2 emissions come from purchasing energy sources. However, Scope 3 emissions come from activities upstream and downstream in the value chain. So this can include emissions from the supply chain as well as customers. As you can likely predict, this is a much more difficult metric to measure. Lastly, I wanted to define the term greenwashing. This is when a company makes false or misleading claims about the environmental benefit of a product, service, or practice. Oftentimes, this is done through misguiding public knowledge, exaggerating information, or diminishing negative practices. Now that we have a better idea of those terms, I want to talk a little bit more about what H&M is. They are an extremely large fast fashion retailer, with their largest markets being in Germany and the US and their headquarters being in Sweden. With thousands of stores worldwide, thousands of employees, and billions in net sales, they are very influential in the fast fashion industry. Their company strategy is founded on targeting young adults through trendy clothing at affordable prices. The main way they are able to do this is through fast production cycles and heavy investment in research and development. Because of this, they are able to produce large quantities of clothing at very quick paces to meet the demand of their customers. However, we know this typically leads to overconsumption and extra textile waste. However, companies continue to induce demand of their customers through social media campaigns and loyalty programs. This shows all the different brands and business ventures that H&M is a part of. I'm not going to dive into specifically what all these ones are, but you can just see how much production goes into the H&M brand and how they are able to target so many different types of customers. The only program that differs from this slightly is Sellpy, which I will be diving back into later in this presentation. So now that we have a better idea of what H&M is, we can talk a little bit more about how they view sustainability. To start, this is a quote from the H&M Group about their sustainability risks and how they interact and interpret those risks. If you read the quote, it is clear that there's a much larger emphasis on how the environment affects a company versus how the company affects the environment. This is a very important viewpoint to keep in mind when evaluating what environmental initiatives H&M chooses to be a part of and why they choose to be a part of it. In H&M's ESG report, they report many supply chain metrics, some of which I included on the slide. Oftentimes, these are expressed as percentages towards meeting certain targets. As you can see, it's really important that these companies report the same metrics year after year so we are able to track the company's progress. For example, a 21% water recycling rate might not sound especially high. However, when we see that this is an improvement from the 2017 baseline, customers are able to be more confident that the company is allocating resources to addressing these specific concerns. In addition to those metrics, H&M also reports their Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. As a review, a company has much more control over their Scope 1 and 2 emissions than they do their Scope 3 emissions. The numbers I got on the screen are actually not from H&M's ESG report, but are from outside research. That is because there is some discrepancy in the numbers. However, this is pretty typical since these measurements are not completely standardized. For example, in H&M's ESG report, when they talk about their Scope 3 emissions, they specifically disclose that they exclude transportation activities in the supply chain from their Scope 3 calculations. Despite the ambiguity in these numbers, it is just important to note how large they are and feel confident that H&M and other fast fashion retailers are contributing profoundly to climate change through their greenhouse gas emissions. After looking at all these numbers, you might be wondering which numbers we are actually able to trust. Fashion Revolution, a nonprofit, thought the exact same thing, and that is why they developed the Transparency Index. This is a measurement for the largest 250 fashion retailers on how transparent they are about their supply chain activities. Their most recent report was published in 2023, and some of their main findings I included on the slide. However, the one I want to emphasize is the last one, where only 1% of fashion brands disclosed a commitment to reducing the number of new items produced. To me, this shows that fast fashion companies are willing to take environmental initiatives, but are not willing to address how their company's strategy of overproduction is contributing to environmental harm and textile waste. This is a graph also from the most recent report from Fashion Revolution. As you can see, H&M got one of the top scores in transparency, and they also received one of the top scores in the previous year, showing that they are a leader in this industry. However, I think that speaks a little bit more to the lack of transparency we tend to see in the fast fashion industry. Most of the companies are concentrated on the left-hand side of the graph, showing that they are not being transparent about their supply chain activities. I think this means that we need to hold companies more accountable for being transparent and for the activities they're performing in their supply chain. In addition to transparency, H&M also reports goals that they have in terms of their environmental initiatives. These are some of the goals that they feature in their ESG report that they would like to achieve by 2030. However, I think it's important to be aware of greenwashing when looking at these goals. For example, the packaging goal says that they want to use more sustainably sourced materials, but they don't say exactly what those materials are, so this is pretty vague. Also, these goals do not include specific action items that the company plans on taking in order to achieve these goals. Because of this, I think us as customers should hold companies accountable for reporting their progress towards these goals to make sure that they actually reach them. Next, I would like to transition to talking more about post-consumer sustainability. Companies often argue that it is harder to gather data on post-consumer sustainability. Because of this, they focus on reporting the initiatives they are a part of and the impact of those initiatives. They do this either in their ESG report or also on their website. These are two initiatives that H&M are a part of that I chose to feature today. The first one is Sellpy, which is one of the largest secondhand clothing online retailers in Europe, and H&M bought a 70% stake in the company. H&M allows Sellpy to use one of their facilities in Poland to support their international sales, and Sellpy maintains control over listing, selling, and shipping. This actually inspired H&M in 2019 to create ThredUp, which is also an online secondhand clothing retailer. Additionally, in 2013, H&M launched Close the Loop. This is a recycling program where H&M would have collection bins in their stores for customers to drop off old clothing or textiles. Customers would receive a thank you coupon, and H&M promised that all the clothing collected would either be reworn or recycled. Even though those programs sound great, it is important to look at the possible negative impacts those programs are actually having. With Sellpy, there are suspicions that H&M purchased a stake in the company just to recover from a few years of declining sales, as opposed to a genuine interest in increasing the circularity of products. There are also questions about the sustainability of the transportation and packaging processes within Sellpy, and thoughts that H&M could do more in order to improve this. With the Close the Loop program, there are definitely doubts about the feasibility. A lot of H&M clothing is made with a combination of cotton and polyester, and to be effectively recycled, these fibers need to be separated. H&M currently does not have the infrastructure to do this. Additionally, many unwearable H&M textiles have been found in dumps in the global south, but H&M continues to deny allegations of this. Again, H&M continues to argue about their post-consumer sustainability and that they are having a positive impact through making sure their clothes are being reworn or recycled, but this is just not the impact we've truly been seeing. There has been technological advancement to be able to separate cotton and polyester fibers, but this is a time-intensive, expensive process that is nowhere near the scale it needs to be implementable for an organization like H&M. Additionally, not only research, but geo-trackers and data have shown that textiles from H&M have been found in the global south, creating doubts about what H&M is actually doing with the clothing they collect. Lastly, I want to take the opportunity to look at ESG as an opportunity to hold companies more accountable for their post-consumer actions. As we saw in the pre-consumer stage, when companies were able to make standardized metrics that they reported year after year, customers were able to easily track a company's progress. If we apply the same logic to the post-consumer stage, we will be able to provide more information for investors and customers about the impacts of post-consumer textile waste. Some ideas of different metrics we can incorporate include clothing production and materiality. Metrics about clothing production could provide more information about the circularity of items, whereas materiality would provide more information about the durability or how long an item can last before it becomes textile waste. Regardless of the metrics we choose, it is important that we create systems to hold companies accountable for their actions. One example of a place that is doing this well is France. In France, they have created the Extended Producer Responsibility Policy, where producers are responsible for the collection, treatment, and disposal of their products in the post-consumer stage. This is done through financial obligation with tariffs, but there is eco-modulation for products that are easy to recycle or have recycled content in them. Because of this financial obligation, companies incorporate sustainable disposal into their company strategies. This has also led to the growth of infrastructure in these communities, with the increased prevalence of collection bins and centers. This has also created economic opportunity by increasing employment in textile sorting facilities and also opening the opportunity for new post-consumer markets. Overall, this has increased transparency and awareness about post-consumer textile waste for customers and companies in the community. These established protocols will give companies better guidelines for how to incorporate sustainable disposal into their operations. Additionally, with this, customers are able to look at companies within an industry and hold those who are not meeting those guidelines accountable for their actions. We have seen that this has been successful since EPR in 2022 was extended to include packaging as well. Overall, fast fashion companies like H&M work by shortening their production cycles to increase the amount of clothing that they are producing. The impacts of this along the value chain, though, are easier to measure in the pre-consumer phase versus the post-consumer phase. However, ESG can still be an important tool in holding companies accountable for their actions, and we should advocate for standardization and increased transparency across the value chain. Overall, as customers and policy systems, we need to take this knowledge to rethink how the fashion industry operates and make it more sustainable. Thank you everyone so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Carrie. If anyone has any questions, attendees or other panelists, feel free to put them in the Q&A, or if you're a panelist, you could also put them in the chat, and we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions. I can get us started. Do you have you proposed a number of really interesting kind of metrics for trying to get at some of this monitoring of post-consumer impacts. Do you have any thoughts on which of those measures that you proposed might be like most feasible, or might be ones that you would recommend adopting like sooner rather than later?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the metrics about the durability are probably the most feasible for companies to report quickly, just because working with their supply chain, I'm sure it'd be easier to gather the information on what is actually going into those products. Also, since these companies are in charge of like the design of their products, they can incorporate more sustainable materials into those designs. And I think that's a metric that customers would be more aware of the impacts of that. So I think if I was to suggest like one metric that I think would be feasible to incorporate first, I would say that would be the one, because also customers are becoming more aware about like the dangers of different dyes and microplastics. So I think that would be especially relevant.
Thank you for that answer. We have a few more questions. So the next question that we received is, how has your work as a research assistant and working on research related to this presentation contributed to your perspective on textile waste?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've definitely learned so much about the issue of textile waste this year, being an undergraduate research assistant in the Aftermath Learning Lab. I'm also a student in the Carroll School of Management here at Boston College. So being able to like incorporate that knowledge has definitely guided my research into this presentation. But when thinking about textile waste, it has definitely caused me to think more about how company strategy is contributing to the environmental health problems we see, like textile waste. A lot of the times when companies are very profit-driven, they might not consider as much the environmental impact of what they are doing. So when companies are focused on trying to like meet all these new fashion trends that are coming quicker and quicker, that just leads to overproduction and more textile waste. So it definitely makes me think more about how we can incorporate sustainability more into company strategy and kind of reevaluate with companies like who they're serving and what their purpose is.
Thank you so much. And we have, I think, time for one more question. Can you explain more about kind of manufacturing responsibility indexes and certificates, if there's like any anything that you know about kind of the state of those right now?
Yeah, I don't have too much background on like specific certificates. I do know that a lot of companies, when they use contract manufacturing or outsource a lot of their production in supply chains, they're using factories in countries with different regulations in like the US, with a lot of them more relaxed regulations, which is why we've seen a lot of supply chains produce so much environmental harm with their productions, because they just don't have as much regulations. A lot of companies like H&M do have like codes of conduct that they have to kind of guide supply chains. But again, it's a little difficult to manage the differences, especially with different cultures or like different regulations. So I think that's definitely an opportunity for growth in the future.